Good afternoon, or depending on where you are, good morning or good evening. Welcome to the 2021 Corcoran Chair Conference of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning at Boston College. My name is Ruth Langer, the Interim Director of the Center, and I want to thank you all for joining us for this annual conference, this time in its virtual form. An element of the gift from the late John M. Corcoran endowing our center was a provision for an annual visiting chair to be awarded to a leading scholar contributing to the work of Christian-Jewish dialogue. Dr. Jesper Svartvik is the 10th distinguished holder of this chair, this year thanks to the pandemic virtually from Sweden. We look forward, we hope, to his being able to be in residence with us at Boston College in the coming academic year. We remain grateful to the Corcoran family for their ongoing interest in the work of our center. Most Corcoran shareholders, a couple of whom we will be welcoming back in the course of this conference, have elected to use their possessions to convene an academic conference in their area of expertise. Pre-pandemic, these conferences met in person. Last year's, convened by Katharina von Kellenbach, was unfortunately forced to be canceled at the very last minute by lockdowns and our unfamiliarity with the possibilities of Zoom. I invite you to see an expanded version of the paper she was to have presented that has just been published in Studies in Christian-Jewish Relations in this year's edition. And that link will be put in the chat momentarily. This year, we have obviously joined the virtual conference world, and we are pleased to welcome many more participants from many more corners of the world than would have been able to gather physically in Boston. This conference is also being recorded, and the sessions will be available on our website and social media channels after they are processed, another advantage of the virtual world. Instead of meeting on 2 consecutive days, we will be meeting this Sunday and next this year. Our goal is, as much as possible, to recreate an in-person conference experience. Unfortunately, we cannot offer you refreshments during breaks or a conference dinner, but we do invite you to provide your own. During the break between sessions and after the second session, there will be options of breakout rooms where you can meet up informally with friends, perhaps make new acquaintances, or continue conversations about the papers you will have heard. More on this later. The Zoom chat is fully available for your use too. This will also be your way to communicate with each other, just to offer greetings, or for more substantive matters. It also allows you to contact those working mostly behind the scenes to make sure that all runs smoothly. If you have technology-related concerns, please contact Yujia Sam Jai, whose name is preceded by Tech. Our center's Associate Director, Camille Markey, the meeting's host, is also available. And of course, a huge debt of gratitude to both of them and to Jesper Svartvik for their work to make this conference possible. After each pair of papers, we will have time for questions, and for these, please use the raise hand function found on the reactions button on the bottom of your screen. This will bring your face or your name to the top of the moderator's screen so that he or she can call on you and you can ask your question yourself. We do ask that otherwise you be sure to remain muted during the formal sessions. This takes the place of the now standard in-person request to please silence your cell phones. Now, to the substance of this conference, titled "To Arrive Where We Started and Know the Place for the First Time, Exploring Pre-Supersessionist Readings of the New Testament." For those who do not have it at hand, Sam is adding, if he has already, a link to the conference program in the chat. Through the 8 papers offered over today and next Sunday, and the responses to them from Professor Daniel Boyarin, we hope to deepen our understanding of the consequences of our retrieval of readings of the New Testament from before supersessionist assumptions colored Christian-Jewish relations. I am eager to learn from our speakers, as I'm sure you are too. And so without further ado, let me turn the virtual floor over to Professor Stephen Pope, a professor of Christian ethics in the theology department at Boston College and an esteemed colleague who will moderate the first session.
Thank you, Ruth, and thanks for inviting me to participate. I too am looking forward to learning a lot from the speakers and the respondent and the conversation that ensues. My job here is to be a train conductor, I believe, and so I'll try to make sure that the trains run on time. We're going to have in this session 2 20-minute talks from our speakers who will speak in order, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for discussion. And as Ruth said, if you can please use the hand raise function and with the technology here, that I'll call on you in the order in which you appear. So I will introduce the first speaker, and then after 20 minutes, when he's done, I'll introduce the second speaker, and then I'll call when it's time for our conversation, and then when we end the session. So the first speaker is Jesper Svartvik. He is the current Corcoran Visiting Chair in Christian-Jewish Relations at Boston College, an appointment he will have for the 2021-22 year as well. He holds a doctorate in New Testament studies from Lund University, where he held the Christus Stendahl Chair of Theology of Religions. His area of expertise include New Testament studies, interreligious relations in general, and Christian-Jewish relations in particular. Dr. Svartvik is an author of 11 books, which include Mark and Mission, Mark 7, 1-23 in its narrative and historical contexts. And he's the co-editor of 4 volumes, including Christ Jesus and the Jewish People Today, New Explorations of Theological Interrelationships. Today's paper is entitled, Those Who Trust Us Educate Us, Daniel Deronda's Quest for His Origins and New Testament Studies. So with that, would you please join me in welcoming Professor Svartvik today?
Thank you. The theme for this conference is a quotation from the 5th and last verse of T.S. Eliot's poem Little Gidding from 1942. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. These words beautifully articulate one of the most conspicuous trends in current theological scholarship, the endeavor to explore non-supersessionist reading of the New Testament and to ponder their implications. In Mary Boyce, what she calls the gifts of non-supersessionist Christianity. A growing number of scholars seek and find interpretations that are not only ethically justifiable post-Shoah, but also in addition historically plausible. And these reconstructions take us to the social and theological context for the early Christian movement before the parting of the ways, before what we now know as Judaism and Christianity. The reason for quoting T.S. Eliot in this introduction is not to address the issue of anti-Semitic slurs in some of his writings. These have been explored by Anthony Julius and others and could be the topic for another conference at Boston College. I therefore move to another Eliot, to George Eliot. And the title for this paper is a quotation from the 35th chapter in her novel, Daniel Deronda, Those Who Trust Us Educate Us. Knowing that some of you recently celebrated Pesach, one could ask tongue-in-cheek as the youngest child, Ma nishtana ha'Eliot hazeh mikol ha'Eliot. And yes, indeed, why is George Eliot different from other Eliots and the vast majority of other writers? I'm inclined to argue that no non-Jew since antiquity before George Eliot took pains to describe Judaism to such an extent on its own term, as she does in her last novel, Daniel Deronda, published in 1876. When preparing to write the book, she studied Hebrew, taking lessons once a week from Emanuel Deutsch, the author of the first study in English on Talmud Bavli. They first met 10 years earlier in 1866. And more than one reader has seen in Gwendolen, in the novel, the author herself, and in Daniel Deronda, seen Emanuel Deutsch, perhaps most clearly in this quotation from the same chapter, the 35th chapter. Quote, "It is one of the secrets in that change of mental poise which has been fitly named conversion, that to many among us neither heaven nor earth has any revelation till some personality touches theirs with a peculiar influence, subduing them into receptiveness. It had been Gwendolen's habit to think of the persons around her as stale books, too familiar to be interesting. But Daniel had lit up her attention with a sense of novelty." End of quote. And it is in this context that George Eliot writes, "Those who trust us educate us." And there certainly was trust between George Eliot and Emanuel Deutsch. The consequences of her novel are immense, immeasurable. According to Norman Lebrecht, Theodor Herzl was seen reading Eliot's book on the eve of the First Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897. And Paul Johnson wrote that Daniel Deronda, in terms of its practical effects, probably was the most influential novel of the 19th century, hence not only comparable to, but even more high-ranking than Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Some of you may know that a number of readers wanted to divide the novel into two. So non-Jewish readers suggested that its Jewish theme be cut out and the remainder be published under the title Gwendolen Harlot. And some Jewish readers wanted to do the opposite, i.e. to remove Gwendolen entirely from the plot and to focus on the interplay of Daniel Deronda, Mira Lapidot, and Ezra Mordechai Cohen, who gradually realized that their hope was to turn their eyes east, looking towards Zion. Daniel Deronda, the Moses figure and protagonist of Eliot's novel, grew up in a non-Jewish environment, but gradually discovered his Jewish roots. And his quest for his Jewish origins is a fitting parallel to a current trend in New Testament studies, which also seeks the Jewish context of the earliest text of the Christian movement. As the current Corcoran chair, I'm collecting, evaluating, presenting insights on how to read the New Testament text without presupposing supersessionism belonging to later times. My book, the result of my time at Boston College, will consist of a series of essays on New Testament pericope that have proved to be either stepping stones or stumbling blocks. For example, the antitheses in the Sermon on the Mount, various texts on Shabbat Kashrut, the parable of the wicked tenants in the vineyard, the deicide charge, the torn veil in the temple, Johannine high Christology, the role of Torah in Pauline theology, the motif of the dividing wall in Ephesians, the question of supersessionism in the letter to the Hebrews, and the vitriolic expression synagogue of Satan in Revelations, just to mention a few of the chapters in this forthcoming book. It's my hope that my survey will become a helpful tool to scholars and students alike, and it will further understanding and respect between Jews and Christians. Now, those of us who want to keep together the stories of Gwendolen and Mira in Daniel Deronda, we see the parallels between Mira, who was saved by Daniel Deronda from drowning, and Gwendolen, who was saved when the malicious Grand Court drowned. Both women survive their slings and arrows and find ways forward in the wake of catastrophe. Now, catastrophe. Arguably the most important historical event in the Hebrew Bible is the destruction of the first temple in 587 BCE and the Babylonian exile. A friend of mine in Jerusalem who survived the Shoah decided to become a rabbi and began his rabbinical studies, eager to rebuild Jewish communities and identify an identity in Europe after the war. And he told me he was so perplexed to discover that the key question in biblical studies after the war, after the Shoah, still seemed to be whether a certain text was the pre or post-exilic. Now, whereas this certainly may have been insufficient for a young person studying to become a rabbi in the wake of the war, it is to a certain degree correct that this remains one of the most important questions one can pose in biblical studies, since so much of the history and theology of the Jewish people depends on what happened in year 587. We have all read the text that wrestled with the pertinent question of the fall of the temple. Was God unable to reach out to the people in this situation? Or was it the destruction, Churban Habayit, was it the consequence of what the people had done? Because of our sins, we are exiled from our land. And in a similar way, one could state that the most important historical event in the New Testament is the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in year 70 CE. More than one listener today may object and argue that the Christian belief in the resurrection of Jesus is far more important to Christian readers of the New Testament. But when using the expression historical event, I refer to something that everyone would agree on, be they Jews, Christian, agnostic scholars, and that would be the destruction of the temple. In his scholarship, Daniel Ulucci has shown that references to the temple are quite different in the pre-70 texts of Paul and the post-70 text, i.e. the Gospels, the other late New Testament texts, the Apostolic Fathers and the early Church Fathers. Quite simply because for Paul, the temple is a reality that he rhetorically can refer to in his arguments when comparing himself to a priest in the temple who brings forth the Gentiles as an offering that is well-pleasing to the God of Israel, for example, in Romans 15. For the authors in the New Testament text written after 70 CE, there is a need to reach out to the readers and show that faith and religious life for Jews and Christ-believing Gentiles alike is possible also without a temple in Jerusalem. Hence, it could be argued that what prompts both most of the New Testament writings and the Tannaitic text is the very same historical event, the destruction of the temple in year 70. But whereas the first temple resulted in a umi pnei chatainu theology, or a mea culpa, we could say in Latin, the Romans' destruction of the second temple most often has been described as a tua culpa event, because of your sins, because of their sins, because of the shortcomings of the Jewish people. So we can identify here two quite distinct, different responses to suffering, evil, and misfortune. On the one hand, the soul-searching and self-critical line of thought that dominates the theological interpretations of the fall of the first temple in the Jewish tradition. And on the other hand, the fall of the second temple, which in the Christian tradition much more often has been interpreted in a way that I would describe as triumphalistic and self-aggrandizing, as a proof of the curse laid upon the Jewish people and the beginning of the Jewish wanderings of the earth. This is not to say that every catastrophe in history could or should be ascribed to the umi pnei chatainu paradigm, certainly not, and especially not if the Shoah is described as a third Churban. I'm merely comparing how the destruction of the two temples are being interpreted by Jews and by Christians, respectively. How then do people react when temples and cathedrals are destroyed in our own times? I'm thinking of the comments after the destruction of Notre Dame de Paris in Holy Week 2 years ago, 2019. And needless to say, there was shock and grief in France. French President Emmanuel Macron rushed to the scene and wrote on Twitter, "As all citizens tonight, I'm sad to see this part of us burning." End of quote. But people reacted not only in France. Kings and queens, presidents and prime ministers from all over the world wrote about how moved they were by the destruction of Notre Dame. For example, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres was one of those who commented on this, quote, "Horrified by the pictures coming from Paris with the fire engulfing Notre Dame Cathedral, a unique example of world heritage that has stood tall since the 14th century. My thoughts are with the people and government of France," end of quote. And one particularly moving example I found is the message sent from the opera in Venice, La Fenice, named after Phoenix, the bird that wings from the Arabian urn, to use Samuel Wesley's expression, which has been destroyed twice as the temple in Jerusalem. And they write, quote, "We burned, but we rose from the ashes stronger than before. We are at your side, friends. Fear not. End of quote. As a matter of fact, I cannot recall one single editorial stating that the destruction of the cathedral in Paris was God's doom over French spirituality, Catholicism, Christianity. Au contraire, Catholics and non-Catholics, Christians and non-Christians, and indeed believers and non-believers alike rose to their feet and said with one voice in one act of speech, when a cathedral is burned to the ground, a whole world weeps and mourns. How then did people in antiquity react to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE? One of the most popular tourist attractions at that time in the Mediterranean area. Jews, of course, mourned, and most likely so did Jewish Christ believers. Why shouldn't they? And why should we assume that Gentile Christ believers acted in another way than did their Jewish sisters and brothers in Christ? Could we assume that they articulated their shock in ways similar to the statement I have quoted that were issued after the destruction of Notre Dame de Paris? After all, in Galatians, Paul writes that Jerusalem is our mother, Notre Dame. It seemed fitting to ask Wendy Farley to read her paper on radical compassion during days of rage immediately after this introduction. She has written on the gap between our treasured piety and our despairing doubts over the goodness of God, and argued that association of bondage with guiltiness is to be avoided, if only because it invites us to a hard-heartedness towards ourselves and others, completely out of keeping with our call to love God and neighbor. Although scholars from various disciplines are invited, the agenda for this conference is fairly focused. 3 papers will focus on New Testament text and topics. Daniel Alucci will survey aspects of supersessionism, sacrifices, and the destruction of the Second Temple. Daniel Jocelyn Siematkowski will explore the parable of the wicked tenants in the vineyard in the 3 synoptic gospels. And Dieter Roth will address the transfiguration of Jesus, reading it adversus Marcionem. And 3 papers have a more systematic theological approach. Mary Boyce will address questions at the heart of our faith, speaking on the gifts of non-supersessionist Christianity. Peter Fan will survey the role of Jews and Judaism in Asian theology. He writes, religious pluralism is the hallmark of Asia. And finally, Kendall Sulan will conclude with his paper on perspectives on apophatic theology. It's fitting, it seems to me, to end our 2 days conference with several papers, plenty of time for discussion, with a presentation of the virtues and weaknesses of wordlessness. In this short introduction to the conference, I wanted to talk about 2 things. The 2 Eliots, both Thomas Stearns and George Eliot. The 2 motifs in Daniel Deronda, Gwendolyn and Mira. The 2 temples, the 2 festivals, both Pesach and Pascha, both Passover and Easter, and the 2 religious traditions that we now know as Judaism and Christianity. I'm so pleased that you all kindly accepted our invitation to read a paper at this conference, and I'm also delighted that Daniel Boyarin graciously has accepted to respond to all the papers, both the 4 presentations today and the 4 remaining next Sunday. And last but not least, I'm grateful to my colleagues at Boston College who are moderating these sessions. A special word of thanks goes to Ruth Langer and Camille Fitzpatrick-Markey at the Center for Christian Jewish Learning, also at Boston College, for stimulating conversation and constructive cooperation in all our endeavors to build bridges of knowledge, understanding, and respect between Jews and Christians, and to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Svartvik. I'll now introduce Professor Wendy Farley. Wendy Farley is the Rice Family Chair of Christian Spirituality and Director of the Programs in Spiritual Direction at the University of Redlands Graduate School of Theology. Prior to coming to Redlands, she spent 28 years at Emory University, where she was Professor of Religion and Ethics and Chair of Theological Studies. Her research has focused on philosophical, feminist, comparative, contemplative and queer theology. She is interested in the role of contemplative practices in supporting resilience, justice, and radical compassion in dark times. She's the author of 6 books. Her paper today is entitled Radical Compassion During Days of Rage. Please join me in welcoming Professor Farley.
Apologies, I forgot I was muted. But I was going to say how joyful I feel seeing all of your faces, and how sad I am not to be together with you, and looking forward to meals and glasses of wine and conversation. I think this will be a very rich community of conversation, and already we are off to a beautiful start. I wanted to say that my paper is not a technical one. It's more musing on this habit we have of demeaning others, and also musing on the gospel as a radical, if not highly successful, alternative to that. The topic that gathers us is Christian supersessionism, and by implication, anti-Judaism. I have no expertise to offer scholars of early Christianity, but as a philosopher and theologian, I'm interested in the theological underpinnings of the Christian tendency to identify plurality as problematic and to seek domination over others, women and slaves and Jews and colonies, immigrants, dissidents, and so on. I'm interested in how this habit became embedded in Christianity, but also how the gospel vision provides an antidote. To begin, I want to reflect on the nature of this kind of hostility, not its historical causalities, but the nature of this impulse to diminish the humanity of others. I think some of its characteristics would be a way of experiencing the world that draws the line of self and other very tightly around oneself and whatever group one perceives as integral to one's identity. This is accompanied by a limited capacity for empathy toward those not identified with oneself, coupled by an exaggerated fear and anger and rage when the line between self and other feels violated. It's something that develops symbolic markers of social hierarchy, which honor some and humiliate others. It's an enjoyment of real and symbolic privilege that requires the diminishment of others. It's an indifference to or enjoyment of the suffering and humiliation of others. In systems of domination, pleasure in the ability to harm others is not an individual perversity, but is upheld by ideology, often a religious one. Cruelty and humiliation become not only social norms, but divinely ordained ones. In different periods, Christianity has exercised the material ability to disenfranchise Jews to varying degrees. But the theological imagination, which banishes Jewishness to irrelevance or to hell, suggests an ancient prolegomena for anti-Semitism. As early as the New Testament, Christians are preparing the theological context to translate triumphalist fantasies into material reality. It is painful to acknowledge the omnipresence of the logic of domination in Christian theology and history. But perhaps by doing so, we might better perceive the radicality of the gospel, however imperfectly it is realized in history. In the birthing room of Christianity, a lovely child was born, a beautiful gospel that dances prism-like in and out of Christian writings, a vision of some reality appearing and disappearing. The kingdom of God is within and among you. Wake up, turn around, it is already here. What does it look like? It is like a fairy tale in which sheep are gathered up for paradise. And they say, we've never seen you. And the response is, no, my dear ones, you have seen me. Whenever you clothed a poor person, whenever you fed someone who was hungry, whenever you visited someone languishing in prison or tossing on their bed of pain, in all of those moments, you saw me. This is heaven, to see the divine in everyone, in every living being, perhaps most especially in those we are trained to despise. If this is heaven, what is hell? It is the inability to do so. The goats, which would be most of us, are in hell, but the beloved has shown a way to walk out. Paradise is within you and among you, always, right this minute. In Christ, there is no Jew or Greek, no male or female, no slave or free. We are humans together, whatever our social or religious identity. What we are most profoundly, our ultimate truth, is that we are beloved. We are held in a great harmony that does not erase our differences, but protects them under the banner of love. But the early church faced a great temptation early on. It is natural to indigenize a new faith in light of the cultural assumptions we are familiar with. So it's not so much that Christianity converted Rome as Rome converted Christianity. Christendom preserved Paul's breathtaking words, but for all the reverence in which it held scripture, it found other truths more palatable. Actually, there are differences between Jews and Greeks, men and women, slave and free. Christianity preserved the right of the powerful to dominate, humiliate, and exploit anyone they defined as less than human. That it is a delight to dominate and humiliate would be unsavory to admit. So these dynamics are masked by an endless array of theological justifications. In addition to the particular reasons offered for why Jews or women or whoever else are inferior, Christianity developed mythopoetic and doctrinal patterns of thinking that infuse in Christianity a taste for violence and an adoration of raw power. We see it in the doctrines of inherited guilt and substitutionary atonement. We see it in the vehemence with which dominant forms of Christianity flayed back pluralism of thought and practice. The logic of domination is perhaps most primordially present in the mythology of hell, which was elevated to quasi-doctrinal status. At the center of Christian imagination is a divine sovereign who has divided humanity between two eternal fates, salvation and damnation. The torture chamber becomes as eternal as divinity itself. The kind of power and motivation one associates with Nero or Caligula becomes divinized. It is noteworthy that rejection of this doctrine, from as early as the attack on Origenism to as recently as the dismissal of Reverend Carlton Pearson, is sufficient grounds to cut one off from the church as a heretic. The religious necessity of dividing humanity into divinely sanctioned humans and demonically affiliated humans is woven deeply into the Christian worldview. The other is not only different, but demonic. The Jew, the uppity woman, indigenous cultures are all utterly opposed to God. And so there are no limits to the cruelty with which they should be treated. Christianity provides itself with basic symbolic and conceptual universe that could hardly avoid the patterns of violence that has haunted it for so many centuries. In considering the deep-rooted quality of Christian anti-Judaism, it is necessary to notice both the particular supersessionist arguments, as well as these symbolic systems that go beyond an arrogance regarding the superiority of Christian orthodoxy toward demonization of others and the social consequences that follow from that. But of course, you will remind me that countless theologians testify to an entirely different way of seeing the world. Origen, Gregory of Nyssa, Julian of Norwich, Schleiermacher, George MacDonald, Fannie Lou Hamer are among the cloud of witnesses who could not conceive of divine power as either unwilling or unable to actualize the divine desire for beauty and redemption. Countless missions to the sick, the poor, the orphaned, refugees, slaves, the hungry, the homeless, the imprisoned, the oppressed, the trafficked, testify to the burning heart of compassion that has provoked countless Christians to heroism in the face of suffering humanity. As a theologian, I take radical compassion to be the heart of the gospel. In the spirit of T.S. Eliot's ceaseless exploration, which unites endings and beginnings, I would like us to imagine a spiritual friendship between a few Jewish and Christian thinkers who, from their different settings, made radical compassion visible not only in their writings, but in their actions. Abraham Heschel, a friend and ally of Martin Luther King, is described in Stanford's collection of King Papers as one who believed that one understood the spark of the divine that exists within each person. He or she cannot harbor hatred for fellow human beings. Heschel himself writes in his essay, "No Man is an Island," first and foremost, we meet as human beings who have much in common: a heart, a face, a voice, the presence of a soul, fears, hope, the ability to trust, a capacity for compassion and understanding, the kinship of being human. The human is a disclosure of the divine. To meet a human being is an opportunity to sense the presence of God. The great civil rights leader, John Lewis, came to public awareness as the young man who was badly beaten as he led the crowd across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. He traces his capacity for radical compassion not to a political strategy, but to the Christian faith he learned from his mother. He was raised in a family of sharecroppers in Alabama, very poor, with little access to education. But he says, "My upbringing, my community, my faith gave me confidence because it was not based on an external definition of our value. We knew we were children of the divine, so we believed in our worth, regardless of what the world might say." Like Heschel, Lewis recognizes this spark in all people. He writes, "I believe that we are all a spark of the divine, and if that spark is nurtured, it can become a burning flame, an eternal force of light." For Lewis, this confidence was not merely belief, but courage. He says, "Being willing to withstand their rage, to serve as a reflection in which they could see themselves, was actually an act of compassion and love that helped release millions of white Southerners from the burdens inherent in the works of hate." This sense that all human beings are united by this divine spark is antithetical to every ideology, every religious or social structure that would diminish some and elevate others. The spirit of radical compassion moves across time and space, a fragile light constantly appearing and disappearing. We find it in the memories of the Baal Shem Tov. Elie Wiesel remembers his grandfather telling him, "In the Baal Shem Tov's universe, no one felt left out." The Baal Shem Tov himself is remembered as saying, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." Why? Because every human being has a root in the unity. And to reject the minutest particle of the unity is to reject it all. In an admittedly ahistorical way of thinking, I think of the Spirit of Christ as the bridge that carried this spirit of radical compassion into the Christian faith. It is sprinkled throughout early Christian texts that took nonviolence entirely seriously. The training offered by the Didache is as fresh as civil rights workers' training at the Highland School. But love those who hate you, and you shall not have an enemy. Abstain from fleshly and worldly lusts. If someone gives you a blow upon your right cheek, turn to him the other also, and you shall be perfect. Responding to harm with anger and fear is as natural as blinking when dust blows in your eye. But some ancient and modern people believed it was possible to cultivate a different way of experiencing reality. This is not a creed or a belief or doctrine. It is a fundamental mode of experience, a capacity to recognize in others a sacred worth and divine spark and to act accordingly. It is a way to see and feel the world. As Emmanuel Levinas says, ethics is optics. But as the Didache and John Lewis insist, this optics is something one must cultivate through training and community formation. It is difficult for many Americans to avoid the individualism of contemporary ideology. Even salvation is usually figured as something that happens to individuals. But Rosemary Freeney Harding, a great mother of the civil rights movement, traces the spirituality of nonviolence to the generations-old radical compassion of her family and community. She traces it to her enslaved great-grandmother. Thinking about her works in the civil rights movement, she says, I am continually drawn back to the model of my family, especially my mother and my great-grandmother, Mariah, and the profound mystic spirituality and deep hospitality they cultivated and passed on to their descendants. She understands this faith as all the ways we remind ourselves of who we really are, in spite of who the temporal powers may say we are, and how we situate ourselves vis-a-vis God. She learned this quality of seeing and feeling the world from her mother, who she says always had iced tea and something freshly baked. Her mother welcomed everyone. She didn't judge, but put out her good china. The transient looking people needed extra attention. But she says, but then mom genuinely enjoyed their conversation and wisdom. She describes her parents' reaction to the murder of her brother. When she asked why they never pressed charges, they replied, killing a person is enough punishment. How is that person going to live a human life with that burden on their heart? She writes, my first ideas about nonviolence came from seeing how my parents responded to my brother's death. She interprets her work for civil rights as the natural result of training in ordinary hospitality and extraordinary response to violence. Many years later, she experienced this radical compassion in her friendship with Clarence and Florence Jordan, the white couple who founded Koinonia House in the 1940s in Georgia. She describes them as not having any enemies, even though they were often targets of the Klan. Clarence describes his own practice of non-hatred as an effort to imagine what was happening in the mind of a racist. What happens to one's conscience when you are responsible for beatings and lynchings and dismemberment? What kind of psychic contortions must a person undergo in order for the mind to accept these activities? Harding's memories are meant to convey to her readers a radical compassion that was not fundamentally about tactics or strategy, but as she puts it, the profoundly spiritual and philosophical underpinnings of nonviolence. The point I wish to make, she says, is about a quality of spirit that was present. For those of us participating in freedom work, for which we often suffered, That spirit allowed connection to a deep source of balance and renewal that transcended the particular physical or psychic infliction being aimed at us. In fact, it was even capable of including our inflictors in the aura. We imagine that there are borders between us, that there are some who exist beyond the circle of care. We imagine that some are inferior to others, that some are worthy of our hatred. In Jesus's parable of the sheep and goats, this is hell. Christianity is stained with this habit of mind, but it is not our fate to accept this logic of domination. We are invited into another vision of reality, another set of practices that would reveal the sacred beauty that is always already here. We are invited to share the world with the sheep who may not know or recognize Jesus, but recognize the divine in everyone. It is discouraging to me how often Christianity is on the wrong side of history. There is nothing more poisonous to the soul than the desire to dominate. It poisons societies and it poisons theology. It even poisons scripture. But we are continually given witnesses to another reality. If we attune our eyes and ears, we find ourselves held up by a chorus of saints. Pamela Lightsey, a Black queer theologian, succinctly puts it, full inclusion is the womanist way. Exclusion and individualism separate us from one another and from divine love. Heschel believed that, as he says, what is urgently needed are ways to cooperate in trying to bring about a resurrection of sensitivity, a revival of conscience, to keep alive the divine sparks of our souls and faithfulness to the living God. Or to conclude with Harding's words, to learn to live as like family, how to live with some strength and care in your hands, how to live with some joy in your mouth, how to put your hands gentle on where the wound is and draw out the grief, how to urge some kind of mercy into the shock-stained earth so that good will grow. May it be so.
Thank you very much for that very thought-provoking and heartfelt talk. Please join me in thanking Professor Farley for that very substantive and visionary talk. So now we have about 30 minutes. And as Ruth said, we could use the hand function. You're probably all familiar with that, but if you see the reactions tab at the very bottom of the screen, there's a raise hand function there. If you could hit that, I'll call on people as they line up. I take it Ruth will speak. They can speak to either address one of the speakers, and then we'll have a question and then a comment and then a question and then some response by the author or by the speaker who was indicated. Is that right?
Yes, no, that's fine.
Okay. It seems to be a shy group. Would anyone like to start us off? Well, if no one else wants to, I will. Professor Farley, you identify key texts in the New Testament regarding radical compassion, and you allude to some by indirection through referring to Rabbi Heschel. Do you want to draw a little bit more out of your key texts in the Hebrew Bible that refer to this radical compassion?
I'm not a biblical scholar, so this is just my general knowledge of these texts. I think, if you'll forgive me for saying this, at certainly the literal level, both the Hebrew and Christian writings are mixed ethically. But there are many treasures in both of them. People in my milieu certainly are very drawn to some of the prophetic texts and the emphasis on the poor, on the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the way in which care for the vulnerable is so crucial to spiritual well-being and to love of the divine, and how, in Abraham Heschel's way of putting it, how painful it is to the divine pathos when we violate one another. There's, so many, the sort of root story of Exodus is a beautiful narrative about rejecting slavery and the long, painful process that it takes the inward and external movement out of slavery into something different. How hard that is even for slaves to move out of bondage and the interior bondage that slavery produces. There's the lovely Job testimony, his fierce, poignant rejection of the idea that suffering is because of punishment. I mean, I could go on and on, I suppose. There's just so many beautiful passages. And when one begins to work at other levels than the literal, you have such a resource to fund the spirit and its yearning for the good.
Okay, thanks so much. Ruth, did you want to raise a question?
I just had a thought when Jesper talked about people not blaming the sins of France for the burning of Notre Dame. My mind went immediately to when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. And there was this sense in New Orleans, city of sin, and therefore the hurricane devastated the city. So I'm wondering whether we're really so past that dynamic as we want to be, as this particular group probably wants to be.
Well, thank you, Ruth. No, I agree. Both Katrina and the tsunami and other catastrophes, very often there is this sin punishment paradigm. So I was thinking of Notre Dame because I was concluding a book on anti-Judaism that week in Holy Week, and I was writing the afterword, and then I saw the church falling down, and was reminded of the Swedish hymn where that uses the same expression that the journalist was using on TV, but in reference to the temple in year 70. And therefore, I think that certainly the destruction of the second temple, year 70, has been theologized to a very high extent. And you see the same there. You talked about Katrina, and I mentioned the tsunami, but I don't see it in reference to Notre Dame. Maybe because it's a church, because it's in Europe, because it's our own narrative, and therefore we don't have that sensitivity. Or maybe we have that sensitivity, depending on what perspective you have.
Okay, thank you. Peter Fan, would you like to weigh in here or raise a different question?
Yes, thank you very much for both papers. I really learned from them. I have a question for Jesper. You compare the destruction of the Second Temple and the burning of Notre Dame. Would you explain further the different reactions by Christians to the destruction of the temple and the burning of Notre Dame? And if they are different, on what are these, if these different reactions are different, on what they are based? That's my first question. And the second question is, what about the burning of the city of Gomorrah, Sodom? How differently did Abraham and other people react to it? And if they are different, was it based on the compassion of Abraham, as the second paper has indicated? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So the first question, please remind me, you said a comparison between the destruction of the Second Temple and the
Yes.
burning of Notre Dame.
Yes, right.
Well, I think it's just because that the Second Temple has been portrayed as the Jewish temple, as the Old Covenant, at the Spätjudentum and late Judaism, everything that ceased to be. And therefore, since something new has happened, and that is presented as the contrast, that's the opposite of the Old Covenant and the Old Testament and everything. Therefore, there is no concern, there is no vulnerability, there is no compassion, there is, you don't integrate it, and therefore I use these expressions on mea culpa, tua culpa. So the mipnei chataeno paradigm only works if you think of it as related to yourself. But Christianity, not earliest Christianity, I believe, but Christendom let go of the temple, and therefore it ceased to be a center of spirituality and became a metaphor for void ways of trying to reach God. It's not where you meet God, it's where God hides. So that was something about your first question. And the second, yes, both early Christian readings of Sodom and Gomorrah and certainly the rabbinic text emphasize that it was a lack of philoxenia in those cities, and that is the reason for them to have to vanish. So that becomes the paradigm of what they do wrong is that they don't show compassion. But for me, that's quite obvious in the rabbinic text, and we don't find it as often as in the Church Fathers' writings, but we have it there as well. Well, thank you.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I have Betty E, but Betty, I don't know your last name, but I will call on you next.
Sorry, hi.
Hi.
My question is for Professor Farley. I'm very interested in the difference between Christianity and Judaism as far as the doctrine of original sin is concerned, and what she might think about how the Christian doctrine of original sin plays psychologically and has played since, I believe it's Augustine, who first framed it. This notion that humans are fundamentally damaged or wrong, or somehow from birth need to have some kind of external mediator between themselves and God, which I think may feed into this notion of turning that outward. And I don't know what the professor might think of this, but I'm very curious about that as a very, very not foundational, but early Christian doctrine. And that's about the best way I can frame it. I hope it's clear.
Original sin is, you might say, a sort of a deep symbol within Christianity. And so it takes on many different meanings. A sympathetic way of understanding it would be to say we human beings fall short of the good we're destined for. We make mistakes. We live in psychological and social and even religious structures that don't do justice to the innate goodness within us. Buddhists have a notion that we humans are less than we could be. They have a different sort of conceptuality for that. Karma, we come into with tainted karma. And so we are this sense that we could be better than we are, and that in fact we will be better than we are. So that would be the sympathetic way of interpreting that. Other elements of it would be, as you put it, that we come in kind of deeply tainted. And I see the destructiveness of that all the time, just in my students. This fundamental sense of unworthiness, particularly with queer students, but it could be anybody. Anyone who's experienced any kind of violence, for example, is kind of hit double hard by this sense of I'm fundamentally unworthy. The only possible relationship I could have before God would be to be condemned or possibly forgiven. But even if I'm forgiven, I'm not different. I'm still damaged and unworthy. And that is not wholesome way of experiencing oneself. And I think you are right that unwholesome way of experiencing oneself is certainly projected onto others. The most pernicious element of the doctrine of original sin, that certainly the way we find it in Augustine, is inherited guilt, which is a kind of intellectual and moral atrocity, I think, that we come into the world deserving to be tortured forever. Is just the most appalling way of conceiving of what a human being is or who God is that I can imagine. And so I do think that has a lot of power to school us in the idea that sadism is basically an element of ultimate reality. I find it a very destructive doctrine in its most classical form. And I want to acknowledge that there are other versions of it that are wanting to give us a kind of symbolic, conceptual way of thinking. We actually do have trouble living into our goodness. And that the power of religion when it's at its best is to help us tend the bondage of the will, as it's called, this inability to live into generosity and courage and wisdom and compassion.
Okay,
I don't know if that helps you, but.
Thank you. I found your talk very inspiring. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Kendall Solon.
Yes, thank you so much for both papers. This remark is directed to Jesper's paper, and I immediately was struck by the claim that the destruction of the Second Temple was the central historical event of the New Testament. And you mentioned that the resurrection would not be the case because it's not generally recognized. But that led me to think that what might be generally recognized about the resurrection is that Jesus was experienced as having been raised. And that, it seems to me, is historical datum as ascertainable as the destruction of the Second Temple. But where that thought leads me is that in how Christians assess the destruction of the Second Temple, it's very true, as you point out, that very quickly that destruction becomes interpreted as a kind of uniform judgment of God, rejection of the Jewish people. It seems to me the New Testament's own witnesses around the significance of the destruction are more ambiguous. And what happens, I think, is one thinks through the New Testament documents in a pre-supersessionist way, is that Jesus more and more becomes a kind of an emblem, or the center, if you like. Emblem is probably not a good word, of God's purposes for the Jewish people. And in that context, the saying, for example, destroy this temple, I will raise it again in 3 days, casts a different light on the catastrophes that befall Jewish people in the first century. So it might be interesting to reintroduce Christian perceptions of the experience of the resurrection as part of the hermeneutical context in which people are evaluating the significance of the destruction of the temple as a building. Seems to open up possible roots for historical reflection and systematic reflection that are cut off if we leave the resurrection out of the picture.
Thank you. And of course, I agree that without a Christian belief in the resurrected one cannot understand early Christianity and contemporary Christianity, certainly. So I agree fully there. I was just thinking, it struck me when I read Daniel Alucci's book, and I think he joins us also here today, that there is such a difference in vis-a-vis the temple before and after 70 in the Pauline writings on the one hand, and the fact that the gospel authors decided to write their text immediately after the destruction of the temple year 70. So therefore, either it's a metaphor that helps you understand who you are and what the risen Christ means for the Gentiles who are living a Christ-believing life in the Pauline letters, or after 70, you have to find ways to live, and therefore these passages on tearing down the temple and I will raise it up, etc. They have to be. They only make sense post 70, and not as predictions, but as paranesis into a Christian community, and that's why I chose the destruction of the temple. But of course, I wanted to be a bit thought-provoking in the introduction here to say the talk about the two temples, and that the first temple is very much our own temple, and the second one is their temple, and it becomes their temple after 70, but not before. That was my idea here. But if Daniel is here, he may want to second or wait until he has his presentation next week.
Okay. So Jack Miles raised a question in the chat, but Jack, can I ask you to comment, raise the question verbally for us? Maybe he's away from the screen for a minute.
I could read the question.
Okay.
It says, I would be happy to hear more about why Daniel Deronda is the most important novel of the 19th century, or the most influential. That was what I see in the chat. Up until preparing this paper, I always thought, and I always said, that Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin was the most influential book. Of course, it's difficult to mention one, but the entire the statement, are you this little lady who started this great war, etc., that it was, if you look for one book that has made such an impact, usually one would say that would be Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And I just started to think that the Daniel Deronda, it was so fascinating to see that she began her life as a Christian. She became an agnostic, and then she decided to. She showed this deep sympathy with the Jewish people, and I thought that her personal journey struck me as it's not only the beginning of the history of Zionism, and one way might have different understandings of that, but also that she talks about the halachic Judaism, with sympathy. And I don't see that in Christian tradition. The only good Jew is the converted Jew or the assimilated Jew. And that was new for me. So therefore, I wanted to test that as a test balloon.
Okay, is there a follow-up question to just the comment that was just made? I guess not.
Right, I look here in the chat. Right, so that's not for me, I believe.
Right.
The rest of the questions there.
Yep. So there are no questions right now. Does anyone want to raise one? I guess, okay.
You do have one question, Steve.
Yeah. Treaty 7 Land Keiko Drager, and I can't read the rest of your name.
That's all right. It's Keiko Dreger Hessline. So I was listening. It seems like there's two places. There's a place in which both of these presentations come together. And I'm sort of, and I think that place might be in the area of trauma studies. I'm particularly sort of resonating with what Dr. Svartvik said about, the destruction of the Second Temple being this major historical event. And then I'm wondering if there's anybody who's done any work, or maybe anybody here, around sort of comparing the Jewish non-Christian responses to that destruction, and then the Jewish Christian responses, which we see a lot in the New Testament works, and the Gentile Christian responses in the New Testament works, and seeing if it's possible to identify different trauma responses to the destruction of that temple. I don't know if anyone's been doing that work, or if that resonates with our speakers.
Wendy, would you like to start?
You are the more expert, so I think there is a custom of letting the younger and more ignorant go first, and I appreciate you handing that off to me in that sense. But I'm very intrigued by the way so much of the biblical writings come out of trauma, directly or indirectly. And I don't know a great deal about how much that's studied as a historical phenomena. I know that there are people who do study that theologically. Shelley Rambo, for example, has done a lot of work around that. Trauma is very distorting, and it does fill us with feelings of guilt. So that when we are harmed, particularly when we're harmed very severely, it's a very common response to say, "Oh, I deserve that," and so I can see how some of that traumatic suffering gets woven into scripture and theology. I think there are a lot of other things happening, but I think it's quite fruitful to think about how writings that come out of very, very deep collective trauma will have a particular shape to them. But it's also a very powerful tool for the non-traumatized to say the same thing. Yeah, you're right. You did deserve that. And so what you might say the injured psyche says, the power of domination institutionalizes, you might say. Jesper, I'm sure you have much more to say about that.
I'm sure I don't, but a few thoughts that once again, if I stressed the importance of year 70, I mean, in the Pauline writings, it may be because it's before 70, it may be because of the genre, there is a distinct emphasis on the finality, or finality, maybe you say in English, of the cross. He's always interested in the consequences. I want to he wants to talk about the cross, yes, but especially about the resurrection. It's not so much fate, but destiny is the future that he talks about. Whereas in the gospel, and it may be because it's post-70, it may be because of the genre, that if you present a narrative, you have to have a certain amount of causality, and therefore it's much more of so why did it end as it does? And therefore there is this emphasis on plot and complot. I don't know if you say that in English, you say it in French as well, like the complot, that there's something is happening because Jesus said something, because Jesus did something, and therefore he is taken away and killed by the Romans. And I just find it so much more healthy to get away from the causality in the New Testament and emphasize finality, not why did the people go to Egypt, but that God takes the people out of Egypt, out of slavery. And in the same sense in the New Testament, so much of Jewish-Christian relations has to deal with, must deal with Holy Week, Passion, his narrative, etc. But it would be so healthy to have a more Pauline perspective and see not where from, but where to. Not, is it whence and whither? Not so much where from, but where to. I think Soloveitchik says that about being in the desert. It's not so much of fate, asking why did this happen to me, but destiny. Where to am I going? Not going looking back to Egypt, but looking forward. But I agree. These very first small steps of talking about the Second Temple as an important historical event in the New Testament leads us to trauma studies, that the reason for writing down the oral tradition in Judaism is very often said that is because the temple fell and you have to write down what wasn't supposed to be written. And I keep thinking that the New Testament is something similar. The only genre we have that is earlier than 70 are the Pauline epistles, and you have to write epistles if you don't have the Zoom account. But after 70, they decide to write the narrative genre. Archetu evangelio Jesu Christu. This is the beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ. So why did he do that? And why did he do it exactly around year 70? Because everything fell apart. And therefore they had to show that there is a future, we can continue living, and this is how it all began, because Paul wrote about how it all ended. They already know the end of the gospel, but they didn't know the beginning of it. And therefore Mark wrote his narrative, and there we have this emphasis on causality. And I think it's healthy, as several of you have said, to look in another direction. So trauma studies here can help us to see not why this happened, but where to it leads.
Thank you very much. We are now at the 2:20 mark, and we will thank our two speakers for excellent starting addresses that will give us threads for continuing throughout the next set of lectures and discussions. So thank you both very much. And my understanding is we will reconvene at 2:50.
Yes, no, let me step in now. What we're going to do during this half-hour break is first give everybody 5 minutes to stretch and do whatever else is necessary. And then we are going to be opening breakout rooms. So there will be a breakout room labeled social room for you to go there if you would like to just visit with friends or make new friends. And there also will be a session discussion room that you can choose to go to in order to continue conversation specifically with the speakers from this session. There also, the main room that you're in right now will also remain open, and you're welcome to unmute and have conversations with people in this room as well. As you know, you can't have more than one person speaking at a time on Zoom. So if you would like to chat with a friend and say, here's my phone number, that would be another option to have a one-on-one conversation. So as Stephen said, we convene again at 2:50 Boston time. That's Eastern Daylight Time, 6 hours ahead of Sweden, or behind Sweden, I guess we are, 3 hours ahead of the West Coast of the United States, and you can figure out where you are from there. So take a few minutes to stretch, and then feel free to join any one of the breakout rooms.